Okay. Okay, so everyone, greeting from Thailand, and welcome our participants from Thailand and abroad to the first event of the month with PSU Open Mobility 2021. In this session, our invited speaker will go through quite a complex and controversial issue with significant impacts on English language teaching. Not only in Thailand, but also in many other countries around the world, I guess, which is about language policy and the teacher education. And before we jump into the intense controversy, a big thanks goes to Ms. Amini Saidi for agreeing to be our moderator this afternoon. And Ms. Amini is an English lecturer at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Prince of Songkhla University, Thailand. She is currently doing her PhD in Sociolinguistics at University Sains, Malaysia. And she has particular interest in language and identity, language maintenance, and language policy. Without further ado, everyone, please welcome Ms. Amini.
Thank you, Ajahn Yusuf. Am I audible? Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yes, clear. And good afternoon from Thailand. Once again, welcome to the PSU Mobility 2021. I am Amini and I'll be leading the session today. Today's speaker is not new, as you can see, because he was with us last month, giving a lecture on language attitudes, ideologies, and identity. But today's topic is a bit different because we're going to be discussing language policy and teacher education. But first off, please allow me to introduce our guest speaker real quick. Associate Professor Dr. Martin Dewey is a reader in applied linguistics at King's College London. His research focuses on the globalization of English and the role of English as a lingua franca. And his research primarily entails exploring the relevance of ELF in language teacher education and the impact this has on how we conceptualize language and language knowledge in ELT. He has presented and published widely on this work. He is a co-author together with Alessa Kogo of Analyzing English as a Lingua Franca, a corpus-driven investigation, and also a co-editor together with Jennifer Jenkins and Will Baker of Routledge Handbook of English as a Lingua Franca. Moreover, he is an editor of Journal of English as a Lingua Franca as well. I think everyone is super ready, Dr. Dewey, to listen to your talk, but let me remind you again that this is a platform for learning and sharing, so your comments and questions are very welcome. You can type them in the chat box below during the presentation, and I will bring them up in the Q&A session at the end. So everyone, please welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Dewey. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Amini, for your introduction, and thank you again for inviting me to be part of this lecture series. I will be drawing on some of the concepts that we discussed in my first lecture. So hopefully many of you were at that lecture. If not, that's not an issue either. This does stand alone as a separate lecture. I'm just going to begin by sharing my slides. Okay, so as Amini was saying, the focus of this lecture is language policy and teacher education. So I've been very interested in language policy and language planning. I'm going to talk about both and how we define policy and planning separately and also in relation to each other. But I've been very interested in the impact of policy on language teaching practices, and particularly, as Amini was mentioning in my introduction, the impact of the way we conceptualize language and knowledge about language in teacher learning and teacher development. So a key focus of my work is in teacher education and thinking about the curriculum in teacher education. And in this lecture, I'm going to try to connect what we know about planning and policy with what we do in teacher education, particularly in terms of the curriculum. So the objectives of the lecture are, first of all, to provide a fairly brief overview of language planning and language policy, looking at the application of policy in a number of specific linguocultural contexts, so different linguistic and cultural contexts, and then look at language planning and policy as a complex process. So part of this lecture will be looking at the complexities involved in language planning and language policy. I will also be examining the role of English within language planning and policy, particularly in light of the status of English as a global lingua franca, and thinking about what impact this has had on national language policy, but also language policy in education. Then I will be considering the relevance of policy and also underlying language ideologies in language teacher education. Ultimately, as I say, to explore ways of reconceptualizing teacher knowledge and the notion of language teacher expertise in light of policy and the current situation with regard to globalization and English language. So what is language? First of all, language planning. Language planning is really best understood as decision-making and change, while language policy is perhaps best understood as a course of action that you take in response to the decision-making and the aim of implementing change. So we can say ultimately that language policy is the outcome of language planning. However, we can also say that there's an awful lot of language policy that happens without there being necessarily very much planning. Okay, so we need to think about language planning in terms of detailed strategies and actions needed in order to implement language policy. The problem that we often see is that, as I say, language policy is not necessarily the outcome of language planning. It's just something that happens ultimately because of existing language ideologies, the kinds of popular beliefs that people have about language and how that impacts what people do. There are different kinds of planning. So I'm going to talk briefly about status planning and then acquisition planning. First of all, status planning is the process of selecting one language or a variety of a particular language from a number of competing options. Okay, it's not necessarily one language, but predominantly it's the process of identifying which language you want to be an official language. This can work at a national level, so you can be nominating a single language or particular variety of a single language as the national official language, or it could be at a much more localized level. It could be broader than national, it could be regional. It could also be much smaller than that at a more localized level. Say, for example, a language policy in relation to a government, a business organization. Okay, so the establishment of this language, the one that's being selected, is identified as the norm, which thus gives it status, and it becomes the official or national language. So for example, an example of this would be, for example, in post-1994 South Africa. So following the end of apartheid in South Africa, the country now has 11 official languages. Before 1994, there were only 2, English and Afrikaans. And here you've got, I'll just quickly click on this link. This is the South African language policy, the national language policy of South Africa. So lots of countries obviously have this kind of document. So it's National Language Policy Framework. This was published in 2003. Okay, and what you have is very early on at the beginning, a statement about the importance of language. Very often the policies will make a statement about the importance of language in relation to identity, but also in relation to national unity. Right, so here it's describing a person's language as their second skin, okay? A natural possession of every normal human being. It's an unusual choice of words, okay? But it becomes really important. You can see here at the end of that first paragraph, the right to use the official languages of our choice has therefore been recognized in our Bill of Rights and our Constitution. It acknowledges that the languages of our people are a resource that should be harnessed. Okay, so really important there in terms of a national statement of intent. Okay, so this is an example of de jure of a language or languages having de jure status, so written into law, it's written in the constitution that a particular language or group of languages will have official status. So that's the situation in South Africa. In the UK, English is the official language. Unsurprisingly, English is the official language of the UK, but it has this official status in a de facto manner. So in other words, it's not written in law, it's not written in the constitution, it's just become established as having official status through common practice. So it's automatically that it's the language of the education system, it's the language of government, and so on. Okay, so it doesn't have legal status in the same way that the South African constitution does. What I'd like to think about is what is the current policy situation in Thailand. I don't know very much about language policy in Thailand. I've started to learn about it very recently in preparation for this lecture. So hopefully you might be able to help me out with this. We'll come back to that. So as well as status planning, we have corpus planning. And so this is changes to the form of the language itself. For example, through the process of codification, where we establish standardized language norms, such as, for example, might happen when you have spelling reform and changes to writing systems. This is what happened with Turkish in 1929. So Turkish script moved to using a Latin script as part of political changes that were happening at the time. It also involves the process of elaboration. So this is the development of the language to meet new functions that the language didn't previously fulfill. So this is something that happens in response to status planning. Okay, so once you've nominated a language or a variety as your official language, then you may need to elaborate that language system as it needs to fulfill a wider number of roles. And this was the case, for example, in Malaysia in the 1950s with Bahasa Melayu, when that was identified as an official language of Malaysia. Okay. Good. Then finally, so we've seen status planning, corpus planning, and then finally we have acquisition planning. So this relates to the learning and teaching of languages. So planning that aims for an increase in the number of users of a particular language or languages rather than its uses. So it's focusing on who uses the language. And this is obviously particularly relevant in relation to language learning and language teaching, and particularly the case with English. Okay, so it's especially relevant in the context of education. You can see an example of this in the European Union policy on languages, which is often referred to, the policy is often referred to as the Mother Tongue +2 policy. And here you have a link. I'll very quickly open that link. This is the European Union language policy. And here you have a statement right at the beginning, as part of its efforts to promote mobility and intercultural understanding. So it's quite different in terms of the purpose of the South Africa, what we saw with the status document in South Africa that talked about the importance of identity and national unity. Here, the language policy of the European Union is designed to promote mobility and intercultural understanding. And an important aspect of this is, and it's highlighted in the final sentence of that opening paragraph, one of the objectives of the language policy is therefore that every European citizen should master 2 other languages in addition to their mother tongue. However,
excuse me, may I interrupt, please? Because we actually can't see the link you opened up.
Oh, you can't see that, sorry.
No, we can't see it.
Did you see the one before?
The one before, we didn't see it as well.
Right, let me stop sharing and then reshare.
Sorry for that.
Thank you for letting me know. Right, can you see this now?
Yes, sir, we can see it now.
Okay, great. So this is the European language policy. All right, and what I was just saying is one of the objectives of the EU's language policies, that's the final sentence in the first paragraph, is that every European citizen should master 2 other languages in addition to their mother tongue. Okay, but given the status of English as a global language, obviously this essentially in practical terms means English. So one of those two other languages is nearly always English. So that's a given. It's not discussed anywhere in the document, but essentially it's master English and one other language, okay, rather than two other languages. An important, but a really important aspect of this language policy is the if you look at legal basis, the last line here, fully respecting cultural and linguistic diversity. Okay, so that's a real important aspect of this document. Okay, I'll go back to my slides now. Okay, good. So that's the mother tongue +2 policy, which is essentially about acquisition planning. So in Thailand, what's the situation in Thailand? What I'm interested in getting you to talk about is what kind of status planning, corpus planning, and acquisition planning has been carried out in Thailand, what historical factors or processes are relevant, so the background and the relevance of planning in Thailand, particularly in relation to national level, regional level, or local level, and then particularly how does English fit in with this planning in the Thai context? So what is the national education policy with regard to English? Is there a national education policy? Has this changed in recent years? And how does this impact English language teachers and what they do? All right. So I'm gonna ask you to discuss those three questions and then report back to me. So if I give you, say, 5 minutes, what I'm planning to do is organize people into breakout rooms, just for a few minutes. Perhaps I'll put the questions in the chat so everybody can see them. Okay. So there are 3 questions there. Okay, let me add them to the chat so you can have a look at them. And if you need to, copy and paste them. All right, so those are the 3 questions that I have on the slides. And as I say, in groups of how many people we've got? So say 10 groups. Okay. If you could discuss those questions for 5 minutes or so. What? Okay. Right. And then you can report back to me. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody. So either you can comment in the chat or you can speak to me about it. I'll go back to the slides. Here are the questions again. Right, so the first question, what kind of status planning, corpus planning and acquisition planning has been carried out in Thailand? What historical factors or processes are relevant? What language policies are you aware of? And this is an important question. Very often there are very established language policies, but the way these policies are communicated may not be very effective. And a lot of the time we may not be aware of what policies are in place. And that's an important question. And then finally, how does English fit in? What is the national education policy with regard to English? Is there a national policy or is it decided more locally? Has this changed in recent years? And how does this impact language teachers? Any comments or questions about this?
Can I share something?
Yes, please.
I think to my knowledge, in the case of Thailand, in the past, there was no clear language policy, but we all know that Thai language had a de facto official status in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And recently, the new language policy has been drafted and approved by the cabinet. I think just last year, I guess, and it took almost a decade to draft this. So I don't know what was, I mean, when we in practice, what are we going to respond to the policy, because it's such a long period of time. But at least it's a good sign. Yeah.
10 years is a very long time. So are you saying that up until this recent policy, that Thai was the official national language, but that was not necessarily written into the constitution, that it was more
it wasn't mentioned in the constitution, to my knowledge.
Right.
But now I can see that efforts are being made to promote other ethnic languages in Thailand as well.
Okay.
And we have more than 70 ethnic languages in Thailand.
Right, that was coming to that next. Yeah, more than 70. Right. Okay, good. According to the Ethnologue, I think 74, but we'll come to that in a moment. What about in terms of English? How does English fit into this national policy framework? Is there an official policy on English in terms of when, for example, it's taught in schools, at what age it's introduced? Or is this something that's decided more locally? Or are we not sure?
Not sure about it.
Not sure about it. Right, that's interesting.
Can I say something? Can I say something? Yeah,
please do.
Actually, in Thailand, we use Standard Thai as an official language, and English is the only foreign official language of Thailand. Okay, so it has official status as well now. English does. Actually, right now, the government, the Thai government use English as a foreign official language. So on the university student need to pass, we call CEFR level. We also use from Europe as well. Yes, in the university level. Levels, I mean. This is happening in lots. This is happening in lots of contexts. Yeah. Thank you very much for that.
May I also share something on this point? All right. From my observation, I believe I'm not sure whether it is written elsewhere in the legal document, but I in my opinion, at least the curriculum that is a policy document, and according to curriculum, English is the most probably important language other than the mother tongue supported in the policy. But now there are, other foreign languages like Chinese, whatever, are also promoted as additional foreign languages, but probably because of the influence from the ASEAN agenda or whatever recently, English is perceived to be the official working language of the region. That's why a lot of policies, for example, the exit exam policies that the previous Ajahn has mentioned, has been emphasized, and many universities in Thailand are implementing this policy by arranging tests for students and set some requirement for them to pass in order to ensure that they have certain level of proficiency in order to graduate before, and on top of other requirements as usual. So that is, that signifies the increasing influential role of English policy, English status in the country, probably. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's pretty much the picture everywhere. That whenever I look into policy in any situation and think about this in relation to the status of English, what you see increasingly is increasing importance being attached to English at the national level, particularly in regional organizations. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, as you say, English is the only official language of ASEAN. So that's the one official language. It's quite slightly different approach than was taken with the EU. And what you see is increasing status being assigned to English in education. It becomes the dominant foreign language in education. It becomes introduced at an earlier stage in the school curriculum. It becomes a compulsory subject. And increasingly, you get a move towards English being used as a medium of instruction first in higher education, but now increasingly in secondary and primary education as well. So it's moving towards gaining further status as a medium of instruction. And I think this is having quite a big impact on teachers, but it's not necessarily being translated in terms of teacher learning and teacher education. So, and that might be seen as quite problematic. I'm going to say a little bit more about that as we move on. Thank you very much for your contributions. As I said, I did do some research into this. I had a look on I don't know if you're aware of Ethnologue. This is a very useful database of languages around the world. I just have to remember, I need to stop sharing my screen, don't I? Right, let me stop sharing my screen first of all, and then share again. So if you're not familiar with it, this is what Ethnologue looks like. So it's a database of world languages organized according to, so it records, for example, 7,139 known living languages. And if we go to Asia, so it's divided up into continents. If we click on Asia, it's then divided up into regions. If we go to Southeast Asia, we can then go to Thailand, and it says population 69 million, living languages 74. But it also records the status of each of the languages of any country. So you've got institutional status. There are 3 languages with institutional status in Thailand, but quite a number of languages either identified as already endangered or in trouble of becoming endangered. Okay, so this is a really useful resource. It's something that I use with teachers in my teacher education programs because I think it's a useful way of highlighting linguistic diversity and engaging in a discussion of the status of different languages in any one context. And that then opens up discussion of the relationship between English and other languages found in any given context. Okay, so I think that's a really useful resource. Let me go back to the slides. I think I have to stop sharing each time I want to switch, I have to stop sharing and then reshare. I will do that just in case. Okay, and then here you have a quote from an article by Will Baker and a colleague who I imagine that many of you will know Will Baker already. So in this article, they're talking about the linguistic landscape of Thailand. And so you get there, it is generally viewed as an ethnically and linguistically homogeneous country. So in terms of official status, it's often described as or thought of, particularly outside of Thailand, people think of it as it has a very strong national official language, and the assumption is that all Thai citizens speak Thai, but it is in fact ethnically and linguistically very diverse, with over 70 minority languages being spoken. I also recently had a look at an article where it took and this reinforces what we were saying before, that the status of Thai as the national language until recently was assumed in practice, so it was a de facto official language, rather than being specifically or explicitly written into a policy document. Okay, all right. And there's a link there to the article. All right, so more significantly, the policy also declares, so this is a recent policy, Thailand's diverse ethnic languages as national treasures and supports the right of getting ethnic tongues integrated into the school curriculum. And you see this move, this is really encouraging when you read this kind of information. And I think this is becoming, progressively, this is becoming the state of affairs that we see, that we get much greater recognition of linguistic and cultural diversity than you used to have in the past. And this is the case in lots of different national settings globally. Okay, I'm going to move on now and talk about different ways of studying language planning and language policy. Now, in a classical approach to the study of language planning, that we can see planning as an ideologically neutral process. In other words, the questions that we think about in language planning are: who are the actors? What behaviors are we attempting to influence by introducing a policy? Who are we trying to influence? For what purpose? Under what conditions? By what means? And through what decision-making process? With what effect? Okay. However, this is a really important point. What we can't do is assume that it is ideologically neutral. It's not a linear process where you instigate, you plan, you publish a policy, and then you instigate that policy. More recently, we've adopted what might be described as critical approaches to language planning and language policy, where the people writing the policy makers, are seen as powerful. So they are in positions of authority and status. They are either in government or they are commissioned by government. So any official policy texts are written by people in positions of power. Therefore, we can look at connections between discourse, power, and ideology, how the policy document itself is a means of expressing that power, underlined by or underpinned by a particular ideological position. And this is something that wasn't really the focus of awareness in the past. So from a critical perspective, it's important that we acknowledge this, the power relations between the people writing a policy and the people who are going to be impacted by that policy. From a critical perspective, what we can say is if we think about policymakers as people in positions of authority with power and status, then what we can say is that a policy document is likely to represent the interests of the dominant group of people, the people with wealth and power and status, and so therefore might reinforce that status while marginalizing others. In terms of the impact of policy on teachers and learners, teachers are often considered as powerless. So teachers themselves may not have been consulted in the planning stage, and teachers themselves might not have been consulted in the writing of policy documents. And that's really something that we need to pay attention to. So we can think about policy not simply as something that is written as a document that is then received and understood. It needs to be interpreted and appropriated. So we need to think about the relationship between government policymakers on the one hand, and then teachers and learners on the other. So a policy, this is a bi-directional relationship. That's the way we need to think about it. So the policy is communicated to teachers and learners in a top-down fashion, but a policy might not be implemented as intended. And I'm thinking, say, for example, in a context where you have English as a medium of instruction, and the school policy is, and it may be the school policy is an English-only policy, but in practice, through observation, we know that in EMI, English as a medium of instruction, in English as a medium of instruction contexts, a lot of the time, teachers will be not using only English, they will be using English alongside other languages in practice. Therefore, that may be contravening the official policy. So there might be some resistance. The policy might need to be appropriated by teachers. And I think this is important that we recognize this. And ideally, the teacher's experience of trying to implement policy in practice needs then to provide feedback to government policymakers so policy can be revised. What we can do is engage in a critical discourse analysis of policy texts. We can interview policymakers, we can interview teachers and their experience of policy to better understand the relationship between policy and practice. All right. And something that I've done in some of my research is to conduct classroom observation, to engage in questionnaire studies and interviews with teachers to investigate their experience of a policy implementation. So more recently, what we can say is that we think about language policy from an ethnographic perspective, or we can do what Hornberger and Johnson describe as an ethnography of language policy. And Ricento and Hornberger describe language policy as an onion. They say it's like an onion in that it is very layered. So you've got at the national level, that's the outer layer. You then have multiple institutional levels. So this is their analogy, the metaphor of an onion with multiple layers. And then in the center, you have teachers and learners, right? So there's this very layered from the outside external national level. That's where the policy is written. Then you have the schools, maybe local government, and then finally teachers and learners in the middle. All right, so we can think about this in relation to agents. The agents are the creators of the policy, the people writing the policy, but also those interpreting and attempting to appropriate the policy. In other words, make the policy their own, make the policy work for them. In terms of goals, we can think about the intentions of the policy as stated in the policy text. So each language policy, and you can see this with the South African one, with the European Union one, and no doubt with the recent Thai language policy, there will be a statement of intent, there'll be an expression of objectives in the policy text, the goals of that text. However, we also need to think about this in terms of the processes involved in the documentation of policy. So you've got the policy document itself being created, then interpreted by the different stakeholders that are going to be influenced by this policy. And then finally, you have appropriation, where teachers, for example, attempt to make that policy their own. They attempt to make it work in their classrooms. The important point to highlight is how policy is, the text itself is discourse. So you can understand that text in relation to what's said within the policy, but also externally, what's said outside of that policy. So there will be, for example, intertextual connections to other national policies relating to all manner of things, for example, laws and policies regarding education. But really important is the context itself. And thinking about policy in this respect means understanding the dynamic properties of the social, historical, and physical contexts in which language policies are created and then interpreted and appropriated. So I'm going to talk about contextualizing this a little bit further by giving some examples and trying to think about how we understand the impact of English language policies in education. I've got a short film for you to watch. I'm going to ask you to just watch a few minutes of this. this is the title of the film is Immersion Film. All right, and the reason I want to show it is because I think it's a really effective illustration of the impact of a particular kind of policy on an educational setting, particularly the impact of a policy on a child in a school. So I'll stop sharing and then start sharing again by going to the video. Okay, can you see the screen? Can you see where it says immersion?
Yes, I can.
Yes, sir.
Right, so it says immersion. Okay, right. So this is the title of the film. Right, it's a lot of it is, some of it is in Spanish but with English subtitles. Okay, and this was a documentary film designed to illustrate some of the negative effects of having an English-only policy in schools. Right. So let's watch. We're just going to watch about 4 or 5 minutes.
¿Qué estás estudiando?
Tu primer examen en Estados Unidos, ¿eh?
Ángela, dale otro huevo al niño, que necesita comer.
Está bien.
Sí, China.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Let me try that again. That was very odd. Let me go back to that. Wait a moment. Let me come out. I think this is an ad. I don't know why that started.
Before communism.
Está bien.
Para que tenga mucha energía.
Tomamos. ¿Quieres una tortilla? Sí.
I cannot see the video clip, Martin.
You can't see it, right? Okay. Could you see it before?
Yes, it's fine.
Before you could see it, but now you can't see it. Okay. Let me stop. Let me start again.
Please share it again.
Yeah. Let me start again. Share again. Okay. Right. We'll get there. Can you see it now? You can see my screen now.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Isn't that right, Cameron?
Yes, Ms. Peters.
Okay, great. Everyone listen up. So we're going to want to work on we get ours from the answer, the information in the story, okay? We're going to go ahead and test, factual test, and try this actus test. Oh, test, your test. Up. So we're going to create, you got to read. First on page 3.
¿Qué dijo? ¿A poco va a empezar el examen? No, es una práctica.
We're going to take notes from the story and we're going to turn it into a math problem and we're going to walk through it together, okay? So the boy ran 3 blocks. So everyone write 3 blocks. How long did it take him to run 3 blocks? Yep.
6 minutes.
Very good, 6 minutes. All right, so then we're gonna take 3 blocks and 6 minutes,
¿Por qué
right?
no corre con los bloques? ¿Qué? Sí, porque el niño corre con los bloques. No,
Okay, so the
corre 3
question
calles.
go on to ask us, how long will it take him to run 20 blocks? What do we do? How many minutes is that?
8 minutes.
Try and remember to raise your hand if you want to answer, okay? No, it's not 8 minutes. Michelle?
18 minutes?
Nope, not 18 minutes. Yes, Enrique?
40?
40, yeah, very good. How'd you get 40?
Oh,
You don't know? Well, 40 is the right answer. How did you get it?
I forgot.
You forgot. Okay. Does anyone know how we get 40? Yes, Moises. Yep, that's right. Very good. Great. Can you tell us how you got that?
40?
Yep, very good. But can you explain to the class what you did here, how you got that?
40?
All right. Joe, do you want to lose your recess?
No.
Okay then. Thank you, Moises.
Can you help me, please?
Can you take a walk with me? I don't want you to worry about the test, okay, Moises?
Sí, estoy preocupada sobre el examen. El director nos dijo que todavía tenemos que hacer.
Just try your best, okay? Do you understand? Not importante.
Sí, sí es importante.
You're right, Moises, it is important. I have to go. I'm sorry.
Disculpe, esto fue un poco... Claro,
Are
¿sí?
those the tests?
Yes, they are. Tal vez en el suelo.
They used to be in Spanish, right?
Yes, they used to be. Muy bien, perfectamente.
So- Can we translate it? Just the math part. I have this one student, Moises, and he would totally ace it.
Come on, we can't. We're not supposed to talk to the kids in Spanish, technically. I like Moises. He's a good kid, but we need to focus on the kids that are... Gracias, señor. Michelle. It's very
Close to being proficient.
right. It's 5% proficient this year. If we don't do any better this year, I don't know what's going to happen. So just please make sure that Michelle follows the directions. Okay?
Okay, thank you very much for your patience with the slight technical problems at the beginning. So I think this is a really powerful film. It was designed to illustrate the how a policy with a good intention can end up having quite negative impact. So just to explain the situation a little bit further. So Moises, the boy in the story, his family have recently migrated from Mexico to the United States. So the school in the video is located in California, where there is a really very high population of Spanish speakers in California. And there are, as you can see, the school principal himself is a Spanish speaker. But the school policy and the education board policy is to teach English only in schools. So children who do not have English as their first language are not allowed to, they're not provided with any kind of language support in the classroom. They are simply immersed in English and expected to learn English that way. But you can see how Moises, as a student, he's very good at maths. He's quite a gifted maths student. He's the only child in the class who can work out the maths problem himself, but he can't communicate what he knows to the teacher because he doesn't have the English to do that. The important point here is that the teacher then goes to the principal and says, let's translate the maths test for him from English into Spanish to allow him to show his knowledge of maths. And the school policy simply won't allow it. So while the policy itself is English only for the purpose of trying to promote English and then make sure that children learning English as their second language are given maximum exposure to the language. The idea underpinning this, I think, is it's a monolingual ideology. And the assumption being made is as long as we maximize the amount of English that these children are being exposed to, they will automatically learn the language. But that's as I say, a monolingual way of thinking about language. What Moises needs is support in his mother tongue in order for him to be able to learn English. Okay. Now, so for some time, there has been this policy in English language teaching of teaching English only in English. But for an alternative perspective, you can see Guy Cook's work. Guy Cook has written about the use of translation as a resource, as an effective resource in language teaching. So that's an example, as I say, of how policy can have an unintended impact. It's not, that needs to be, that kind of information needs to be provided to policymakers. What I want to talk about now is what research I've done in relation to looking at teachers' beliefs about language and the way this might be impacted by policy. So some of my research has focused on trying to consider what attributes, values, and status are assigned to language teachers, particularly in relation to how they identify as either a native speaker of English or as a non-native speaker of English, but also how they might be identified by others as native or non-native speakers of English, and to then reevaluate the prestige that we customarily associate with native English-speaking teachers, and to see how this prestige manifests itself in English language teaching policies. My ultimate goal in doing this kind of research is to adopt a critical perspective so that we can re-examine long-standing assumptions about the role of native speaker English as, first of all, a pedagogic model, and then secondly, as a means of determining language competence. So to what extent should native speaker English be the goal of language learning? To what extent should that be the policy that we want to promote this particular kind of English? And also, what impact should that have on the medium of instruction in terms of how we teach English in the classroom? And this is something that I've been researching for some time. Now, here I've got participant. So this is a Korean teacher who took part in a study where I was interviewing people. I was asking people to provide a biography of their learning and teaching experience. And I wanted people to talk about their experience of professional identity, particularly in light of the increased focus on English as a medium of instruction. So that's, as we said that already before, that there's increasingly, we see this as a policy. First in higher education, an increasing number of universities are offering degree programs where everything is taught in English. Okay, but then that is also having an impact in secondary education, where more teachers, including teachers who are not language specialists, so subject teachers who maybe teach geography or history or science, don't have a language specialism as their background, are being asked to teach in English. Okay, so this is from an interview with Tahi, who's as I say, a Korean teacher, but a teacher who's traveled quite a lot for study. She studied for an MA in the United States, and then a PhD in the UK. So she's a teacher, very experienced teacher who has a PhD in language education. And what she talks about is how she feels peculiar, she feels different that, and she talks about how she's had to adapt. She's adapted her identity because of how much she's traveled. So she says, my failure, she talks about people's perceived failure of her, of the expectation that she was different from other people. So she says, I feel I do not belong anywhere. Because I feel I am 40% Korean and the percentage is very high and I do not claim any relationship with other countries, I must be Korean. But the experience of travel and living in other countries has made her feel different from other Koreans. And she talks, in particular, she talks about an experience in that happened as a consequence of new policy in Korea. So she says that after graduating from university, she became an English teacher, started teaching, and she talks about one of the incidents that happened to her while she was teaching in Korea that led her to study in Hawaii, to do her master's degree in Hawaii in the United States. So, and the policy is the government in Korea in 2001, as in many other contexts, determined that English teachers should teach in English, so adopt an English-only policy for the classroom. The teachers were told not to translate, not to use Korean in the classroom, to teach English only in English. Okay. And she said, I tried to teach my entire class in English, when before perhaps she would have used a lot of translation. And she refers to one incident where one of the students was acting out. In other words, he was sort of misbehaving in class, and simply said, why don't you stop trying to speak in English and just teach in Korean? So that you've got the child in the class questioning the teacher's English, challenging the teacher's English, and saying to the teacher, your English is not good enough, use Korean to teach us, use translation. So you've got this again, an unintended impact of a policy. So the government policy, underpinned by, I think, a very monolingual understanding of what it means to learn another language, informing what teachers are told they should do in their classrooms. In other words, use only English, don't translate into Korean to help learners. And that's having quite a negative impact on this teacher, because she's being questioned by the other children in the class. Okay, another important point to think about here, and it's something that Tahi in that interview touches on, that language policy and identity are really importantly connected. Okay, so this is, I'm going to stop sharing there and show you a very quick, brief news article from Northern Ireland. All right, I don't know how much you know about Northern Ireland, but it's a very divided country. Let me hold on. Let me stop. I'm trying to stop. I've still got the video open. I'm going to share my screen, but close the video from before. Okay, right. So the situation in Northern Ireland is an interesting one. So in Northern Ireland, you have the official language is English. All right, that's that most people in Northern Ireland speak English. Can you see my screen? Can you see that? Yeah.
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for letting me know. So this is, so then in Northern Ireland, it's often described as a very divided community, divided along religious and cultural lines. So you have a majority Protestant population, minority Catholic population. In the Republic of Ireland, this is a Catholic population. So there's been a lot of tension. You've probably heard of that before in the past. There's been a lot of tension between the two communities, and this manifests itself in language. So what happened in recent years, the government in Northern Ireland, so the capital of Northern Ireland is Belfast, the council in Belfast decided to use the Irish word, there's the word for water on on drain covers. So they were essentially, they were bilingual. So they introduced the Irish word alongside the English word. But because the majority population is only English speaking, right, this resulted in there being quite a lot of negative discussion about this. So it's despite only a minority of the population speaking Irish as their vernacular, the language is really important to the wider nationalist community, the community who wants to belong to the Republic of Ireland, the Catholic community in Northern Ireland. Right, so it's an important symbol of identity. The Irish language becomes an important symbol of identity for this community, but that is not accepted by the majority population. And what happened is a lot of people started to deface the Irish words on signs. So they scraped off the Irish word, leaving only the English word. So it created quite a lot of additional tension. So it's a really important point I just want to highlight with that story, is that language policy can be a really important source in relation to identity, but it can also lead to conflict. Okay, returning to the slides then, we can think about, let me move that down to that, it's better like that, isn't it? So we can think about policy, as I said before, in terms of goals or intention, right? So really important questions in any context are that teachers have to think about is, why is English being taught? Now, what is the main purpose for having English as a subject in schools? Or why is English being used as the medium of instruction? And there are ways of thinking about this question. So we can look both forward and outwardly. So a lot of the time English is taught, this move towards greater use of English, that policy towards English in the curriculum can be seen as the result of the importance of English for business, for trade. It's seen as an important language for economic growth. It's important in academia, so has important status in higher education and academic research. It's the language that we primarily use for knowledge sharing. It's a language of wider communication, and it's very, very widely used in the media in many contexts. So these are sort of ways of looking forwards and outwards, but we can also think about policy in relation to looking back. So, for example, the status and the role of English in the curriculum may be the result of a colonial past, right? So it might be the language of former colonizers. Yeah? And you see this in Southeast Asia. Yeah? So there are many Southeast Asian countries that were former British colonies. So, like, for example, Malaysia and Singapore. So English has status and function there, partly as a result of what happened historically. We can also say that English might be important for national unity. So in many settings, English is given official status because it is seen to provide national unity where there is a lot of linguistic diversity. Sometimes selecting English as an official language may be less controversial than selecting a local language as the official language. If that creates tension between different groups, there may be no alternative. So in some settings, English might be the official language, or it might be the most dominant second language, because there's simply not any other alternative available. So the important thing to remember here is that language policy is not neutral. Remember, I said that early on, and you can see that in relation to that video clip as well of Moises in the school in California. Now, there's power and status are involved. Okay, so other agendas, social agendas, economic agendas, educational agendas, these come to the fore, they become prominent only if they converge with a political agenda. Okay, so it is always these agendas that will be used as public justification for policy making. So there might be a really strong public justification for a policy, but that doesn't necessarily suit the social, economic, or educational purposes of a policy. So if you think about this, different national governments have prioritized the teaching of English. This is very, very widespread globally. But to what extent, think about this in your own context. So in the context of Thailand, we've already said that there's been a recent policy statement, and that English is taught more now in schools than it probably was in the past. But to what extent are the motives underpinning these policies? To what extent are those motives clear to people? Are they made explicit? Are there any other agendas that might be identified that are not made explicit? So we need to think about the implementation of a policy. What exactly is involved when a policy is implemented? So a policy is a text. It's essentially a document outlining what is expected to happen. But also, far more than this, we need to think about what happens in the classroom with a policy. To what extent are the aims of the policy appropriate in a given education context? How are there differences between what's stated in a policy and what actually happens in practice? Why are there these differences? So again, we need to think about the creation of the policy, how it's interpreted, and whether and to what extent that policy is appropriated, or is it appropriate to resist that policy in any way? So we can think about creators, interpreters, and appropriators. In other words, the agents, the relevant agents in any policy situation. So who do you consider to be the creators of ELT policy? Does English language teaching policy, is that something that is decided at national level? Yeah. What is the role of the government? Or what other agents create policy? Are there supranational agents, so international ones, international bodies, international organizations, such as ASEAN in Southeast Asia, or the EU, the European Union, in the European context? What role do the various interpreters, so the school principals, the managers, the communities, including the parents of children at schools, teachers, what role do these interpreters play as they understand a particular policy in different ways? And what about the appropriators? Who has an effect on policy as they implement it? And to what extent, for example, are teachers able to have some kind of agency in the way policy is created and interpreted? And an alternative way of thinking about policy is not so much that it's something that is implemented, but rather that is enacted. So in recent theory, people studying language planning and language policy have talked about the enactment of policy rather than the implementation of policy. So, for example, Maguire et al. Say that in much writing on education policy, the meaning of policy is frequently either just taken for granted or seen as an attempt to solve a problem. Okay? And what they're saying is we need to think more critically and more constructively about this policy. So in English medium instruction, for example, planning and policy can differ substantially from how English medium instruction operates in practice. And that speaks to the very complex nature of the interface between policy and practice. It's not a straightforward relationship where you have a policy that becomes implemented and then all of the intentions, all of the goals of the policy are simply achieved. That it doesn't work that way. So rather than think about policy as being implemented, we think about it in relation to enactment. Right? So Maguire and colleagues say that they recognize policy enactments as multi-layered. Remember, I mentioned that you got that metaphor of the onion. Okay, they're multi-layered but also messy, and they argue that enactment is theoretically a richer concept than implementation, because it better captures the multifaceted ways in which policies are read, and how they need to be interpreted in relation to contextual factors. And that's a really, really important point. Okay, in English language teaching policy, I mentioned before intertextual connections to other policies. Okay, now in the UK setting, for example, so a question that we can ask here is, what public discourses are relevant to English language teaching? What public discourses are relevant to the identification of a policy in language teaching, particularly in the media? So how do the media talk about English? How do the media talk about English language learning and language teaching? How does that have an impact in terms of that, of any given policy? So I'm going to stop sharing again for a moment and open these links here. Okay. And there's a couple of links that I'm going to share with you. Bear with me a moment. Sorry, while I change screen. Okay, good. Right. Stop sharing and then start sharing again, reshare. Okay, so there are two, we've got two links here. The first is, so this is about, so I was saying intertextuality, right? So how language teaching policy can be informed by or influenced by other policies. So this is from the UK government website, right? And this is a statement about the citizenship test in the UK. So if you want to apply, so if a resident in the UK wants to apply for citizenship to become a permanent citizen of the UK, anyone wanting to do this has to demonstrate knowledge of English in order to achieve citizenship status, if you want to achieve settled status here in the UK. So that this website provides a list of approved English language qualifications, right? So you can prove your knowledge of English by having a recognized English test qualification. And then it lists, right, if you want to apply for citizenship, you can use a B1 level qualification, all right? If you want to settle in the UK, so that's different from citizenship status, all right? You need to, that's really important. So this is an important government policy about the role of English in determining whether or not someone has the right to live here. Okay, so another website, all right, this is from the Independent newspaper. So this is a national newspaper in the United Kingdom. And the report, this is from February 2019, feels like a long time ago now, given the pandemic. So this is, okay, here you have the headline of the news article is "Government toughens rules for people seeking citizenship with new English language requirements." So in 2019, and it says here, teachers in schools will be supported.
During the turmoil and trauma of this pandemic.
Sorry, didn't need that. So teachers in schools will be supported to promote British values, right? So the language being tied up with cultural values, promote British values across the curriculum, and there will be a new national strategy for the English language. So you can see that the government policy in relation to, and this is really in response to public concern and public discourse about immigration and worries that people have about immigration. And that's having a direct impact on what the government says in relation to the relevance and importance of English for demonstrating whether or not you have the right to apply for citizenship or settled status. Okay, so these are really sort of powerful discourses, if you like. Okay, I'll return now to the slides again. So that's a really clear indication of how any kind of language policy or language in education policy is not written independently or autonomously. It's part of the wider social context and the wider political landscape. So what discourses there may often be, if you think about policy, again, think about it in the context of Thailand, there may be other discourses, as there are in the UK, that are not directly involved or not directly related to English language teaching, but are still relevant. Okay, so for example, skills needed by industry. What global texts and global discourses are relevant? So for example, the International Bill of Human Rights or Education for All, how are those kinds of texts and discourses relevant to language teaching? And to what extent are texts and policy and discourses being referred to in English language teaching policy texts? What's the relationship between them? Okay. So if we adopt a dynamic, this is really important, the dynamic social, historical, and physical context in which English language teaching policies are created, interpreted, and appropriated. In order to engage with this, in order to understand how dynamic this all is, it's crucial that we think about the elements of the social context and how that might affect the way English language policies are being enacted, created, and interpreted. What elements of the historical context affect the way English language teaching policies are enacted? And then finally, what elements of the physical context affect the way ELT policies are enacted? So it's really important that context and setting have, it's really important to be aware that context and setting have a really important impact on policy and then ultimately on practice. So where do you fit in? If you're an English language teacher, or if you're involved in language education in any way, how do you see your role? Where do you, as a practitioner, fit into the mechanisms of language planning and policy? How much agency do you have as a teacher in terms of what to teach, how to teach it, who you're teaching, why you're teaching, when you're teaching, and so on? And so what's important to think about in any teaching context is, how do teachers prioritize the decisions that they need to make in relation to what they teach, particularly in relation to what they teach and how they teach it? So the syllabus, content, and the teaching methods being used. How do teachers prioritize those decisions? And also, what about learners? Where do they fit into this? This is just a representation of a mechanism, right? That's just designed to illustrate the complexity involved, all right? Okay, this, as I said, raises really important questions regarding language teacher education. And an important aspect of my work in terms of trying to understand how all of this is relevant in teacher education is trying to incorporate and promote a social dimension in language teacher preparation and development, that language teachers and their learners need to become aware of social context and also power relations in those social contexts. So I'd like to just briefly consider the role of sociolinguistics. So if we say that sociolinguistics is the study of the social dimension and the social properties of languages, yeah, that's what I mean by sociolinguistics. We can say that, and this is from an edited book by McKay and Hornberger on sociolinguistics and language education. What they say is that while sociolinguistics is not a field which seeks to inform classroom methodology directly, yeah, they say it does play a central role in helping define the nature of language itself, and hence in clarifying what communicative competence in a second language entails. And I'm really interested in this. What they say is that we need to try to reconcile diversity with common standards. So a policy might be to promote a particular variety of English, a common standard, but any classroom will reflect a rich diversity of linguistic backgrounds. Students bring to the classroom not only other languages, but also different varieties of English, culturally learned ways of using English. And what they say is, it is against this backdrop that teachers in general and language teachers specifically face what they describe as the challenging task of respecting linguistic diversity while promoting common standards. Okay, so that's I think this is really important, that teachers need to be able to acknowledge, respect, incorporate cultural and linguistic diversity in their work practices. And I think this requires us to rethink the way we traditionally have seen the relationship between theory and practice in language teacher education. So I think research and theory require a reconceptualization of conventional views on language, conventional views on learning and teaching. From a teacher education perspective, two paradigms in particular have been relevant in recent years. This is the development of critical pedagogy, so a critical stance on language teacher education, and a sociocultural perspective. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, what I mean by sociocultural perspective. So a sociocultural perspective, according to Johnson and Arshak-Saya, is that the responsibility of teacher education from a sociocultural perspective is to present relevant scientific concepts to teachers, but to do so in ways that bring these concepts to bear on concrete practical activity, connecting them to their everyday knowledge and the activities of teachers. So in the same way that I talked about policy, needing to think about the policy in the specific setting or specific context of a given classroom, we need to do the same when we think about the goal of teacher education. All right, so we're not just teaching concepts to novice teachers or learner teachers in a neutral way. We are presenting them with concepts that need to be connected with and that need with local context, that need to be understood from the perspective of those local contexts. So taking this idea further, an important point that Johnson and Gollenbeck, so again, the same Johnson, this is Karen Johnson, has written a lot about sociocultural perspectives in teacher education. So, and what they say is how teachers actually use their knowledge in classrooms is interpretive, socially negotiated, and continually restructured. And so there's not a clearly definable knowledge base where you have a start point and an end point, and you simply need to learn those concepts, you need to learn those techniques, those procedures, and so on. You need to interpret knowledge. It needs to be socially negotiated and continually restructured. And this is important to bear in mind, particularly in relation to new policy. If there's a change in policy, teachers need to think about that, and they need to be supported in thinking about that in relation to their own context and their own understanding of that context. So another important aspect of this is that professional development emerges from a process of reshaping teachers' existing knowledge, beliefs, and practices. So in teacher education, we can't simply impose new theories, methods, or materials. These theories, methods, and materials need to be reshaped alongside existing knowledge and need to be reformulated in terms of existing knowledge. Now, one way I've attempted to engage with this in my research is to engage in narrative, what we call narrative inquiry. So which is a particular research approach. So in narrative inquiry, teachers are encouraged to produce personal stories that enable a re-examination of their practices. It entails being compelled to confront how their understanding of teaching came about in the first place. So how did their own ideas about teaching materialize in the first place? So a narrative inquiry asks teachers to re-see what and how they know in practice. So what they know about language and language teaching methods, how they know those methods, and think about looking at that in a different light in practice. And again, this is really important from a policy perspective, okay, to understanding what any kind of policy, what impact that policy might have on the way they think about language and the way they think about the methods used to teach language. A number of of scholars have discussed this. So, for example, Anita Pavlenko encourages self-reflection through linguistic autobiography. So asking teachers to give a personal narrative of their experience of learning and teaching, and that this encouragement of self-reflection, it shows how teachers may have internalized conventional discourses, for example, about the relationship between native speakers and non-native speakers. And what Pavlenko is saying is we need to critically question those internalized conventional discourses. And they're the same conventional discourses that you often see underpinning language and education policy. Alistair Pennicook has talked about the importance of this concept of a praxicum, which is the connection between, so praxis is the word often used to connect theory and practice together. A praxicum is thinking about the practicum, in other words, the teaching practice that novice teachers have to go through in order to become qualified. So it's taking that concept of praxis and bringing it to the teaching practice setting. So Pennicook, in his study, identifies critical moments as being important. So, for example, including recognition of non-standard English in the classroom. That's an important critical moment that teachers can become aware of through this kind of self-reflection and questioning of the relationship between theory and practice. Now, so the approach that Johnson and her sociocultural perspective, the approach that Pavlenko and Pennicook take are very different from conventional approaches to knowledge. So conventionally, in our accounts of professional knowledge, teachers are marginalized. They're not seen as central. They're often marginalized in policy. As I said before, teachers' voices are not necessarily taken into account or represented in any policy documents. They're not really seen as knowing professionals or as agents of change. So their agency conventionally has been limited. Okay, they are seen as, in teacher education, we see the teacher as the recipient of knowledge, and that's problematic from a sociocultural perspective. Researchers, by contrast, conventionally have been positioned as privileged outsiders. Now, they are the ones who create and hold knowledge. In terms of policy, it's the policymaker who has privilege and status. They create and hold knowledge. Language biographies and narrative inquiry can serve as a means of overcoming these problems, of giving teachers, in other words, giving teachers more voice and more agency. And I've got a couple of examples that I'm going to talk about from a project, a language autobiography project that I was involved in at King's College London, where teachers were asked to provide both an oral and a written narrative account of their language learning and teaching experiences. And just a really brief summary of my findings from conducting these biographic studies is that teachers in their biographies, in their personal stories, often refer to experiences of discrimination. They talk about unequal access to employment opportunities. They talk about unfavorable contractual terms and working conditions. So the focus of my research was looking at the personal stories and the biographies that non-native English-speaking teachers were expressing. So I was particularly interested in non-native English-speaking teachers. Teachers often also report having their own claims to professional expertise and language undermined or denied. Okay, and here you've got a case study. This is a case study of Nahid, who is a Marathi speaker, and Marathi is spoken in central and western India, okay, around Mumbai, okay, which is on the coast here. So Nahid describes herself in her personal story as a Marathi speaker. It's her first language or mother tongue. I learned it as my first language at home. However, I would also say English as I have been educated in an English medium school, and I am more proficient in English than any other language I know. So ethnically, in terms of her ethnicity and her cultural identity, she identifies as a Marathi speaker. It's an Indian language, so say. She also speaks Gujarati, other Indian languages, Gujarati and Hindi, as well as some German. She has a certificate. CELTA is the certificate in English language teaching. So she's got an initial teaching qualification in English and also the postgraduate certificate in education in the UK with an ESOL specialism. At the time I interviewed Nahid, she had been teaching for 8 years in London in an English as a second language setting. Okay. The important point here is that although she identifies ethnically and culturally as a Marathi speaker, English has, because of her education and because of her profession as a qualified and experienced English language teacher, English has become her dominant language. Okay, so she's got this personal linguistic identity and professional linguistic identity. Now, I asked Nahid to complete a questionnaire study that was also part of this same project, in which participants in the questionnaire were asked to think about their own teaching context and then record their level of agreement, whether they strongly disagreed or strongly agreed with a series of statements designed to reflect a particular perspective or a particular position on language teaching methodologies. And there were a series of statements, some of which were designed to reflect what might be described as a conventional or a non-sociolinguistic classroom perspective. Okay, so here are some of the conventional ideas about English language teaching. So non-native, for example, non-native English speaking teachers should adopt an English as a native language variety as their target model. It is important for learners to use correct language forms when speaking English. So emphasizing the importance of standard language and grammatical correctness. Teachers should correct learners' errors, so the teacher's response to non-standard items. And then English language learners prefer to have native English speaking teachers. So these are Nahid's responses. Okay, she strongly disagreed with the first of these three statements, and she disagreed with the final one. Right. So in other words, we might say that Nahid is expressing a fairly sociolinguistically well-informed classroom perspective, in that she's not agreeing with these conventional ideas about language teaching. All right. In terms of statements in the questionnaire study that can be said to represent a sociolinguistic perspective on the classroom, for example, teachers should encourage students to experiment with new language forms. The student's L1, first language, and the student's sociocultural identity are resources that can enrich English. Developing communicative strategies is more important than learning to use correct grammar. So these, I characterize these as fairly progressive statements, or if you like, classroom policies on practice that are informed by sociolinguistics. And here you can see that Nahid strongly agrees with each of those. All right. So she's got a really strong understanding of the importance of sociolinguistics from the point of view of language teaching. However, you can see some conflict here in the way she talks about her own English. So this is in interview where I'm asking Nahid how she thinks other people on the course see her, right? And this is following a sociolinguistics module that she studied. So at the time of the study, Nahid was studying for a master's degree in applied linguistics. And she responds by saying that, yes, a couple of times students in the class have described her as a native speaker. She says that shocked me, even though English is her dominant language, remember. She says, I'm not a native speaker. What's important then is how she reports her own language use. Even though she's been teaching English in London for 8 years at the time of this interview, she talks about her own accent in a very negative light. Yeah? And I say, you have an Indian English accent. I know you don't like your accent. So she likes her accent, but I do not teach pronunciation in the class. I'm very conscious of it. So what you have here is a teacher with a really strong understanding of how sociolinguistics is relevant in language teaching and how an understanding of the social dimension of language can have an impact or should have an impact on our policy and our practices in relation to what we do in the English language classroom. She's still here when interviewed expressing conventional views about what kind of English constitutes a viable model or learning goal. Okay, so what we need to do is think about conventional concepts in a really critical light. So, for example, we need to rethink the concept of a speech community. Speech communities are no longer, of course, geographically and physically defined. We are all members of many different communities. We interact outside of traditional linguistic and cultural boundaries. And an important aspect of this is the concept of superdiversity, okay, which Blomert and Bacchus have said compels us to abandon the presumption. We're in a superdiverse world, in other words, right? We need to abandon the presumption of stability of communities, replace them with a more fluid view of networks, knowledge communities and communities of practice, all of them dynamic. Yeah. So language repertoires in a superdiverse world are records of mobility, movement of people, language resources, social arenas, technologies of learning and learning environments. And all of this means that I think it's really important that we rethink conventional concepts about who constitutes a viable, or what constitutes a viable model of English, what kind of English we should be teaching, how we should be teaching it, right? But this raises all sorts of issues, right? So change, any kind of change in pedagogy can be unsettling and disorienting. It can be really difficult. Planned changes tend only to be implemented if teachers acknowledge the need for change. So if we want to write a new policy and implement policy change in practice, it's hugely important, crucial that teachers acknowledge the need for change. So there needs to be dialogue between people writing policies and people wanting to, including researchers, people wanting to instigate any kind of change, and the teachers who are going to be influenced by or affected by that policy. Teachers need to be involved in the research that leads to curriculum development. Institutional and national support are important, and teachers' beliefs and attitudes do not always lead to change in pedagogic practice. It's really important to acknowledge that. And we need to be aware that change can have an impact on teachers' sense of identity. And I think that is so often overlooked in policy and representations of good practice and discourses around what constitutes good practice. That doesn't, we've not been very good in the past at recognizing the role of teachers in all of this and how this can impact teachers' sense of identity. Okay. Now, in my first lecture, I talked about this relationship between language and its social properties, that it's adaptive and dynamic and complex, and how conventionally, particularly in language policies, language is seen in this way. It's normative, codified, standardized, and so on. So I just wanted to return to that slide because I think it's particularly important that we think about this from a language policy and education policy perspective, that we give much more account to the difference between the natural properties of language and the way language is understood and characterized in policy documents. Okay, and as I say, really important that we think about this in relation to teachers' sense of identity. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to stop speaking there. Hopefully, oh yes, I've got some time left for questions. Good. And I realize there's a lot there, trying to connect together theories about language planning and policy, the impact of policy on practice, and then the role of teacher education in all of this. It's quite complicated, but hopefully I've made some sense of that for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dewey. Thank you for walking us through the language policy and education in different parts of the world and making us aware that the social factors are something that we need to take into account to understand how the language policies are created and interpreted in our country. And what we need to work on now is to answer the question you posed earlier, how do we fit in this process? And I feel that we as teachers bear the burden in this process, especially when we are, the inner part of the onion metaphor. We are the key person who will put the policy into practice, and it's not an easy task, I think. Right? We are moving on to the Q&A session. If you have any questions or you want to share your thoughts on what we have discussed earlier, feel free to jump in anytime and unmute yourself, or you can just type the question in the chat box. We have about 12 minutes left for this session. Any comments? Maybe we need to give, yeah.
I saw someone raise his hand.
Yeah, there was a raised hand.
Yes. Please.
Yeah, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Dr. Dewey, for the lecture. It was really interesting. And I would like to ask, because my PhD is about language policy in EMI, and I applied Sposky framework for language policy. But I don't know about, what do you think about the Sposky policy framework? Do you think it's applicable? And because they said Sposky still have thinking in a classical or traditional way. It's not complex enough. But I find Sposky framework is very integrated and it can focus on 3 directions: language management, language beliefs, and language practice. And I don't know, what's your opinion about it? Do you agree or find Sposky framework it can be applicable and can be reach to that complexity of the language policy in EMI?
I think it's useful as a framework. It doesn't quite capture the complexity in the same way that I think the policy enactment theory can, but it is probably much more workable from a teacher's point of view in terms of trying to navigate where we are in relation to policy. So yes and no. So I think it's slightly oversimplified. The risk is that it's slightly oversimplifying the relationship between policy, theory, and practice. But it is a really good starting point, because it does enable teachers to find a way into this, thinking about trying to navigate where they are in terms of what a policy statement says and what this might mean in practice for an individual teacher. So I think it can be useful, yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Louis.
Any more questions from the audience?
I mean, particularly in relation to teachers themselves, and to what extent do people feel that teachers have the right to set their own classroom policies? No? Oh, there's another raised hand.
Ajahn Mishai, I can see your hand.
All right, thank you very much, Ajahn Amini, for inviting. All right. Oh, what's wrong with my screen? All right. Thank you very much again, Dr. Dewey, for your insightful presentation. And I'm quite very much interested in your in Tae scenario. Remember the South Korean one, because I think I happen to have read some of the papers on this, and so I wonder, because I think the thought and the implication from there can be kind of applicable to Thai context,
Right.
which I think is not too much different. So so in Tahi's case, she tried to use English in teaching English, right? But she got some kind of feedback from her student commenting on her English. So in this scenario, what would you think? What would be like a possible solution to this? For example, in this scenario, should this English only policy be dismissed, where the teachers have insufficient capability whatever to apply it, or the policy shouldn't be applied in the first place, because there might be some people like Moses, like the boy who knows math but can't express himself properly, or it could be maintained but with more support for teachers to improve her English to be able to conduct teaching in English properly. So what is your say about this possibilities?
Right. There's a lot of questions there. I think they're all really important questions, and I think how those questions can be answered again will depend on individual context and the relationship between teachers, their learners, and other stakeholders, so the school principal, the parents. But in order to answer those questions, I think we can avoid those questions becoming problems in the first place if there is better communication between practitioners and policymakers. So I think in the case of Tahi, I don't think it should be a question of her simply abandoning the EMI policy because it doesn't work. I think the government intention, the Korean Ministry of Education's intention of teaching English in English is a really effective one, but only if there is some discussion between teachers and their experiences and then policymakers. So there's got to be dialogue. And this is what's crucially missing in the time. The policymakers write their policy, maybe they read what researchers are saying about language, but in my experience, at least, policymakers don't necessarily pay much attention to what people doing research have said about language learning and language teaching. So I think it's crucial that we try to find a way of opening up much better dialogue between people writing policy and people who have to enact that policy. So in an ideal world, Tahi, along with other teachers, would be able to provide feedback on what this policy means for her in practice. Clearly, Tahi could have benefited from more support, more training. Perhaps if she'd been, before the policy was implemented, if she'd been given some additional English language tuition that might have improved her proficiency level before she was asked to teach this way, then that would help. So I think the important thing is the dialogue. That teachers are able to say, okay, we understand, this is how we understand the goals and the objectives of this policy, but from a practical perspective, I can say this is going to be problematic, this is problematic, and therefore we'd like to revise the policy. I mean, there's been quite a lot of discussion. There's a special issue, if you're especially interested in EMI, there's a special issue of the Relk Journal from summer 2021, edited by Peter da Costa and two of his PhD students, which deals with this. And I think in the case of EMI, there are so many different ways that institutions interpret what is meant by EMI. Sometimes it means English only as the medium of instruction. Sometimes it means English alongside other languages as the medium of instruction. And I simply think that there needs to be open discussion and dialogue about what a policy means in any given situation. The policy itself, often policies are written without paying much attention to the specific context and setting, or the needs of teachers and learners in that context and setting. I hope that's answered your question. But yeah, there were a lot of important questions there. But dialogue, that's my main message is dialogue between people writing policy and implementing policy, such as school education boards, school boards, principals, and then the teachers themselves.
Thank you very much indeed. And that is a very kind and insightful answer indeed. Thank you very much, Dr. Thank you.
Yeah, we have another hand.
Ajahn Muslim Roka, yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is a very interesting talk. I have one question regarding teacher agency in response to language policy. In your opinions, how can I ask? What are the role of teacher agency in order to respond to language policy, especially in the classroom?
Yeah, I think it's really important that teacher independence, teacher autonomy, and teacher agency are recognized locally, and I think this depends on the institutional culture. So, what does a university or a school? How do they value? How do they see the role of teachers? And I think it's very, very difficult for teachers themselves to claim agency if they're not supported. I think teachers should have it should be up to individual teachers ultimately to make decisions in their own classrooms about what they teach and how they teach it. As long as that is from an informed position, and as long as that there is some kind of discussion between the education management, the teachers themselves, and then the students themselves. So everyone needs to be able to communicate what's important for them. But I often see in many contexts that teachers are not able to claim agency, that they are simply told, this is the syllabus that you're following, here are the materials that you're using, this is your textbook, and you're simply told to follow this, and you're audited in many respects. I mean, in the are inspected on a regular basis. Teachers don't necessarily have as much responsibility for their own decision making as they used to in the past, because the national curriculum is saying to teachers, you've got to teach this. This is what you're teaching at this age, and you've got to assess your students in this particular way. I think that's problematic. I would like teachers to be able to claim more agency, but again, it's a question of education culture. How much do we value teachers, and how much do we appreciate their skills and expertise, and how much does government recognize that teachers are the ones with knowledge? That doesn't often happen, unfortunately. Thank you for your question. I hope I've answered it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, Ajahn Yusuf, are you raising your hand?
Yes. Let's take a look in Thailand, for example. Most English interlocutors are from the outer and expanding circle. Using different English linguistic conventions. Considering the current degrees of English pluricentricity, to what extent do you agree or disagree for ELT courses, policy or curriculum in Thailand to incorporate the global English concept into the policy and curriculums? Or in other words, do you think English teaching and learning policies, curriculums, or pedagogies should be reconceptualized and reinvented to embrace multilingualism, interculturality, and diversity of English?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think they do. I think we do need to reconceptualize them. I think we're still very much influenced by a monolingual standard language ideology, and I think the world. Yeah, that's why I had the quote from Jan Blommet on super diversity, because we're all operating in a multilingual world, but multilingualism is not taking into account sufficiently well in the way we conceptualize knowledge about language and knowledge and skills in relation to teaching language. So yeah, I think we need a much more multilingual concept of language and communication. Yeah, I think it needs to be reconceptualized in most settings. I think it's gradually happening. I mean, you do see policy documents that talk about the importance of multilingualism. You can see that in the European Union language policy. You see it in the national language policy of South Africa. There is greater recognition of multilingualism, but it's not necessarily being translated in the way we conceptualize language and language knowledge. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any more questions? I think we are running out of time.
Yes.
It's 5 p.m. So I hope that Dr. Dewey's inputs today and all the pedagogical implications will be beneficial to us in designing our lesson in the future. So now let's move to the end of the session. Can you, as participants, please take a few minutes to fill in the evaluation form, which will be sent in the chat below. And after you complete the form, you'll be directed to another link for the e-certificate of participation. So fill in that form and your certificate is ready to be collected in your email address given. All right.
Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. I also hope that that's been relevant and informative. And I hope that's contributed in some small way to your independent individual pedagogies and the thinking that you're doing in terms of trying to understand how to navigate the world of language education. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you. And while waiting for some of you to complete the form, let me take this opportunity to announce our next event, which will be happening on this coming Saturday on the 29th of January. We have our guest speaker is Mr. Armando Perez Morfin from Mexico, and he'll be talking about intercultural communication between students of English as a foreign language in Mexico and Thailand. And for this time, the webinar will start at 8:30 in the morning because our speaker is from Mexico. So if you are interested in joining this webinar, please go ahead and register through this link below as well. All right. On behalf of the organizer, I would like to thank Dr. Martin Dewey for your contribution and insightful presentation. And thank you everyone for being with us today. We'll see you again, hopefully on this coming Saturday. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
สวัสดีค่ะ บ๊ายบาย
Thank you very much.